So how are connections used? This was an amazing new feature that was introduced in version 12, because previously you was a little limited on exactly what all you could do in the same construction method. It was kind of a one setting fits all, like I want to do qualified blind dado construction, or I want to do DAO construction. And so now with the connection manager, we have individual control part by part. So for example, I could put DAOs on my drawer stretcher, and a qualified blind dado on my deck, and cabaneos on my toe kick if I wanted to. And I could do all of those inside of the same construction method. And so it's a very flexible way to apply connections to different joint types. So for example, I'm looking at the list of connections that we created back in our ProPath section. I have qualified blind dados, stop dados, pre-drills, and even sets that combine dados and pre-drills. And so how are those applied? Well, if I go to assembly and edit my construction method, if I go to the connection tab, here's where I have my list of parts. And for example, if I click on deck, it's going to ask me, how does my deck and finished in connect? Well, I could do a qualified blind dado on my deck to finished in, and on my deck to unfinished in, I could do just a pre-drill if I wanted to. And so that's what I'm talking about with that individual control, situation by situation and part by part. One thing that is critical to easily being able to understand and apply connections is having a well thought out naming method. And I'll show you how I like to name my connections and why I do that. So when we go to apply connections in our assembly wizard, if I go to the connections tab and go to my deck, and if I hit this drop down, you'll notice that this list is sorted alphabetically. And so I want to keep that in mind when I'm naming things, because it's going to use alphabetical sort, so I want to kind of group the similar things together. So let's go back to our connection list. And so how I like to think of it is high level category first, period, subcategory, period, subcategory, and so on, as many categories as I need. And so it really becomes a flexible way to easily recognize, okay, here's all my dados, here's all my line bores, here's all my pre-drills, and then like if I had cabaneos or channel lock, like lock DAO connectors, I might start those with connector dot cabaneo, connector dot lock DAO. Or if I was doing DAO construction, I would probably do DAO dot large and DAO dot small. And so, you have some flexibility with how you name it, but just be conscious of the fact that you want things to group together visually in the list. So just think about that as you're naming things. And again, it's going to help you so much when you go trying to switch connections on a construction or set up a new construction for the first time. Because when you're looking at a list of 200 items with just random names and, your stop dados are way up here, your through dados are at the bottom, and everything else is just somewhere in between. Just not a good strategy, and just when you're trying to train in new people or even just functionally use it, just not a good option. So this video is for those of you who have migrated from earlier versions, and when you go into connections, there's 100 or 200 different connections, and they're almost all identical. You may have 20 different stop dados, 30 different through dados, and so you just want to find a way to clean this up. So in this video, I'm going to import a construction method from Solid 11 and show you how this might look, and then my strategy on how to delete this and get back to a nice clean looking connection list like we have right now. So I'm going to go to setup package and import that old construction method. Okay, my import is complete. Let's look what a mess this might have made. So if I go to connections, now I have a whole list of items, and it didn't do too bad. I've seen times where when people migrate to the version that has connection manager, there's like 200, 300, even I've seen 400 one time, because they had a lot of construction methods with just slight differences. But this will be fine for this example of how I would go about cleaning this out. Because again, I want to apply my naming standards and I want to delete anything that's unnecessary. So, number 38, for example, stop dado 1/4 inch deep. Well, I already have a stop dado. So, how should I get rid of this? If I right click and delete, it's going to say, are you sure you want to delete? And I'm going to say yes. And then it's going to say, oh, it's actually in use here on the other loose toe. And this is a wonderful feature, because what this means is, well, I don't want to break all my construction methods by deleting this, but I can actually just replace this with my stop dado 1/4 inch that I know is correct. And so this strategy is how we're going to go through and clean everything up without breaking our existing construction methods. Now, one tip before I go on any farther, take a hard look at your construction methods, because if there's things here that you don't need, you need to delete it, because it's going to make it way easier to clean up your connections. So if there's a construction here that you haven't used in 10 years, just delete it. You can copy and recreate it if it happens to come up in the future, but you'll be much happier with a cleaner library. Okay, so I would just continue kind of this idea of, okay, here's a dado 1/8 inch. So I would hit delete. It would show me where it's being used. It's actually being used on 3 constructions. And then I would replace it with my dado stop 1/8 inch. And be careful not to get confused with which one is your main ones and which one is the ones that were imported. So again, stop dado 1/4 inch deep. And you do have to be careful, because on some of these, like on stop dado, there isn't a lot of differences. Like the adjustments might be slightly different, and that's why it came in as a separate stop dado. But most times, if you apply a 1/4 inch stop dado, you want that to be globally used across the board. You don't want 10 different stop dados at 1/4 inch deep. So the go, like I said, delete as much as we possibly can, and always replace with your main version of it so you don't break the construction method. And so we can just keep working through. Here's a through dado, hit delete, see where it's used, and replace that with my dado through. And now, sometimes there'll be things that we don't really have a replacement for. Like, I didn't have cabineos in my library. So, I would probably keep these. And so you don't have to delete everything, but the things that you do keep, give it a better name and make sure that, it's in the same format so everything will sort correctly. Now, I like to use just a large and small format rather than this nailer, regular, stretcher, and nailer, and like all these different names. I might do connector.cabaneo.large. So now those two would be in the format I want, and then I would just delete the nailer to try to cut it back to 2. And again, I like the large and small. I think it's less to maintain, but if you for some reason need that middle size, like if you want separate spacing or whatever for your nailers versus your toe kick or your stretchers, you can create more of those. I just found that large and small fits enough needs for me, and I can share the spacing for all the small parts, and I can share the spacing for all the large parts. So let me replace this cabaneo nailer with cabaneo small that I just created. Okay, that's looking good. And then we got some construction hose. Now, I already have a pre-drill. They're calling it construction hose, but really, anywhere that I have construction hose, I know that I just want to use my pre-drill. Now, there's really not a great way to see. I mean, it shows regular, and then this is stretcher and nailer. So I know that I'm going to hit delete. Oh, that actually wasn't used. If it doesn't pop up and show which construction it was on, it's just not being applied, which is great. Let's see where stretcher is. So it's being used in quite a few places. Now, like I said, I know this is my pre-drill, so I'm going to map this to pre-drill small because it says stretcher on it. And then for the regular one, I'll do pre-drill large. And before you go, like, if you have a list of 100, 200, just, make a backup and go through it just like I am. If you happen to break something, like, it's not going to be hard to fix. The benefits of a clean library far outweighs trying to just limp through this and still use it. Because, like, who wants to see 10 different line boards whenever they try to figure out which one to assign? That's just asking for a mistake when you're going through and assigning constructions. So again, I know these are my main 2 line boards, so why would I ever want to use something else? If you do have situations where on one construction you use it with an 1/8 inch gap and the other you use it with a 1/16 gap, great. You can have multiple line boards, just make sure they're named very appropriately. I have put it on fractions. So this is an 1/8 inch gap, so arguably I should probably put that right in my name. That way I could have another 5-hoe line bore that has a 1/16 gap or something. If you need that flexibility as you're selecting different construction methods. If you don't need multiple options, don't have them in here. So hopefully this gives you an idea. Like, it's pretty safe with the way they set it up. I love how they made so you can recognize where it's at. And my advice, take the hour, sit down, make a backup, look through your constructions, see if you actually need all of them, and then just start deleting. And you'll be so much happier than trying to limp along every time you make a change to your construction, trying to figure out which one to apply. In this video, I want to talk about my strategy with how to set up connections differently for large parts versus small parts. And this really only affects connections that deal with spacing or sizing. So like a stop dado or a through dado, you don't really need a large and small. What this does affect is a blind dado, a qualified blind dado, pre-drill, dowel hose, anything that involves spacing or sizing. So for example, I'm looking at the end view of this cabinet, and you'll notice I have a blind dado on my large part, my deck. And if you'll notice, the spacing from the ends here is 2 inches. Whereas if I look at my drawer stretcher, the back spacing is 1 inch, and this is 1.5 inches. And so what I'm doing here is I apply my large part connection to anything that I know is going to be larger, and I apply my small part connection to anything that's going to be smaller. To further illustrate that, I'm going to go into my connections. And if you'll remember from our construction method, if I click on deck, you can see I'm using a large part. Whereas if I click on drawer stretcher, now I'm using a small part. And so with this strategy, even if they're very similar or they can be the same, I still like to separate them because that way I have control. Like if my bander needs a little bit more room in the front on my small parts, I can control all my small parts separately without affecting the way my large parts go together. So I really like this strategy, and if you feel like large and small is not enough, you can certainly create a large parts, nailer parts, toe parts, and stretcher parts. You can build it out as much as you need, but from what I've seen, for most people, they can get by with simply the large part and small part strategy. It keeps fewer connections and less to maintain, but that should, hopefully that clears up a little bit of the strategy of how you should manage your connection library as you're creating new ones. And so if I look at my connections, because I have a large and small qualified blind dado, anytime I do a set with that, I have to also do a large and small there. So if you can keep it to large and small, great, keeps your library clean. If you want to do a separate one, like if your toe kick needs to be slightly different than your drawer stretcher, or if your nailers need to be different than your toe kick, you will have to separate them farther. But the large and small should get you a nice starting point, and only break it out more if you need to. Connection sets are a powerful way to combine multiple connections into one connection. So for example, if I wanted to do a qualified blind dado along with pre-drills, I have to create a set for that. And so if I double click on my set, you can see I have my dado qualified blind and my pre-drill. And the reason we have to work in sets like this is because in the construction method, if I go to connections and go to deck, you'll notice that I don't have a way to select multiple connections. If I pick qualified blind, there's no way to add on the pre-drill. And so that's why we create sets, and we simply select it, and that will fire both connections. Now, one other tip, when I am naming my set, I like to start it with set. That way I can see that there's multiple things going on. And try to keep these names as short as possible, but still informative enough that you can see what it's doing. And like I mentioned in the last video, if you're using the large and small part strategy, you'll also need to account for that at the end of every set. In this video, we're going to talk about my line bore connection strategy. This can be a little bit confusing to set up because there's two main different types of line bore. There's bore by opening or bore per shelf. And so with bore per shelf, that's where you have like 5 or 7 or a certain number of hose every time there's a shelf. And so what happens is, if you have a wall cabinet or a tall cabinet, it'll drill 5 hose and then leave a gap and then drill 5 more. Now, some people don't like those gaps, and so they want to use bore by opening. So in this video, I want to show you the way I would recommend setting it up for both bore per shelf and bore by opening. So I'm starting out in my connection library, and we can see here that I have 2 line bore connections. I have one with 5 hose, and if I double click into this, we can see my side gap, and it's set on bore required, right? And then there's 5 hose and just a few other details as far as spacing. Now, what if I'm doing bore by opening? Should I have a connection create, I'll just call it line bore opening, make it a line bore type. I could set my clearance. And then there's this option that says use case hose. So if I'm doing bore by opening, should I use the case hose or should I set it up with the bore required. And there's two main areas where this is controlled, so I'm going to go into a job to explain this farther. I currently have the 5 hose and the 7 hose and the line bore opening. That's the three things I have regarding line bores. And I'm actually not even going to be using the 7 hoe option in this example, but I'm going to show you the ways that we can utilize this so that it's still pretty flexible and you can still toggle back and forth at the cabinet level. So let's go into a job. Okay, so when I click into my wall cabinet, you can see I'm using the bore by shelf method, right? It's drilling 5 hose, leaving a gap, and drilling 5 more. And as I move these shelves around, these hose just move right with it. And I really like this. It feels very smart. You know, for example, if I decrease the depth of this shelf, my hose go with it. And so to me, it just feels very smart. Now, sometimes I like to do more than 5, so it leaves less of a gap. But nonetheless, if you're selling with dealers or you don't think your customers will like those gaps, then bore by opening is still a great method as well. So let's look at how I currently have it set up with how it's firing this way and how we might need to change this so that we can still toggle back and forth if I want a certain cabinet bore by opening and still be able to switch back and forth. So currently, if I go into my room settings and modify my construction, if I go to operations and go to line boring, it's currently on bore required hose. And that's the only questions we have. The bore required and nothing else. So really what's controlling those is if I go to my connections and go to adjustable shelves, there's this line bore for 5 hose. Okay, that's all well and good. That's easy to understand, right? Because I said bore only required hose and I assigned my connection that has 5 hose, that's why we're seeing this like it is. So what if I want to switch to a bore by opening construction? Let's take a look at it. I'm going to go to room, modify for this room, operations, and line boring. And let's do bore by opening. And I'm going to click next. And I want to reference from the bottom, 4 inches and 4 inches. No, I want it to start exactly 4 inches from the bottom instead of trying to equalize it. Got my diameter, and we see just a few spacing settings. Okay, so that's easy to understand. Now, just with switching that, now if I go into my cabinet, you can see it's on bore by opening, right? It's no longer just boring required hose. But at first you might say, well, in the connections, you're still using that 5 hoe thing. And I am, and I like this. So the reason I like this is because if you have a cabinet where, let's say your main line boring strategy is going to be bore by opening, but every now and then you want to do bore per shelf. So if we leave it exactly like I have it set up, I can come into this cabinet, go to boring, and switch to bore required hose, and it knows what to do. If I don't leave, if I go back into my construction, if I had used this line bore opening thing that I created just at the beginning of this video where it says bore case hose, if I had used that, the cabinet wouldn't know how to respond whenever you tried to manually switch it at the cabinet level. So even if you are using bore by opening, I would still recommend setting up this 5 hoe or 7 hoe or 9 hoe pattern, whatever you want to do, and assign that in your connections. And when I say connections, you go into adjustable shelves and assign the 5 hoe or 7 hoe or whatever number you like, even if you're using bore by opening. And so that's what gives us the ability to toggle back and forth. Now, let me remove that override. And I'm going to go back to my room, and I'm going to go back to my default construction. Now, what if I'm using the bore required hose like it shows here, and then on one cabinet, I want to switch to bore by opening? Well, let's look what happens. If I go to properties, boring, and bore by opening, this works too. And now, a very important fact here. If you created a new construction and never answered the bore by opening questions, this wouldn't work. And so let me show you a little trick here. Let me go back into my construction. The reason this worked for me is because I toggled this and answered all the questions and then went back and toggled back to bore required hose. So even though I'm not using this last question as my default, Cabinet Vision still knows the answer to these questions here later on whenever I toggle that in the cabinet. So if you're not seeing the correct bore by opening settings, whenever you toggle to that in the cabinet and your main method is the bore 5 hose or bore 7 hose, what you need to do is you need to come into your construction method, change it to bore by opening, and answer all of the questions. Click OK, and then come right back in and set it back to your default. Just because you change it back to bore required hose, Cabinet Vision still knows how you want to do your bore by openings for whenever that happens. So that's kind of a little bit quirky, and that's why I wanted to make a whole video for it. So both options are viable options. They both have their pros and cons, but whichever method you do, set it up in this way like I showed you in this video so that you can still, at the cabinet level, decide to do it the opposite of how you normally do it. So hopefully that was helpful.